my camera, but I'm afraid to put it back in
No,
time. So
don't do anything.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, this is my office in Chicago. I rearranged the bookshelves here just for this event.
Excellent.
The first three shelves have books that relate to my work about Puerto Rico. And then
excellent.
I have fiction. I'm going to rearrange the fiction, but I thought instead of hiding the Puerto Rico books in the closet, which is what I had, let me put them here in case somebody in an event is like, oh, wow, that looks like an interesting book. And then,
Think it might be great.
All right, we are live on Facebook, and I'm going to let everybody in, and then Dr. Hall, if you want to wait maybe 20 seconds or so, and then we can start.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Bethany Connect Speaker Series. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hall. I'm in the English department and have been for 22 years. And it shows in my COVID hairstyle. Marisel Vera is our speaker today. She makes her home in 2 time zones, her native city of Chicago and our neighbor, Pittsburgh. A poet, dramatist, and fiction writer. Her short stories won the Willow Review Fiction Awards in 2000 and 2003. Her first novel, If I Bring You Roses, was published in 2011. The Taste of Sugar, her second novel, came out 6 months ago from Live Right, a Norton imprint. And even in the pandemic, it's attracting a great deal of attention. Called a masterful work of historical fiction and a Latino Grapes of Wrath by the Washington Post, a breakout novel by Kirkus Reviews, and Capacious by the New Yorker. The novel was listed in June as one of the 28 best books to transport you this summer by the Oprah magazine. It was called one of 2020's 50 most notable works of fiction by the Washington Post in November, and one of the 12 best Latino books of 2020 by NBC in December. The Taste of Sugar travels from 1825 to the first years of the 20th century, and from the mountains of Puerto Rico through the mainland of the US to the Hawaiian Islands. A family story. It is also the story of all Puerto Ricans of the diaspora. A love story. It's also the story of the silenced history of a nation dispossessed of land and of language. It should be coming out in a paperback edition in July, as well as the beautiful hard copy. Marisel is currently writing a novel about 4 young women in the neighborhood where she grew up, Humboldt Park on the west side of Chicago. For those of you who are Pittsburgh Pirates fans, she attended Roberto Clemente High School. She visited our campus 3 years ago. It was great to have her in my classroom then. It's an enormous pleasure to have Marisel Vera back with us today. President Rodenberg will tell you a bit more about her, and then we will hear her read some excerpts from The Taste of Sugar, and she and I will talk about her work a little bit after that. The Q&A function is open for questions for those of you who have some, and we'll be checking that out. Dr. Rodenberg?
Yes, I also joined Dr. Hull in welcoming Marisel to our virtual experience today in our complication series. And I just want to tell a personal piece of this is that I met Marisel back, 2-3 years ago now, and her husband Fred at a Highmark Awards banquet in Pittsburgh. And we just sort of found a corner together and became fast friends. We started talking and realized we had a lot in common, but our shared interest in diversity and culture really expedited our conversation and friendship. And so they invited us to join them at a Pittsburgh Penguins game in their seats. And we had a fun evening that evening and got to know each other even better. And Marisel was looking for a quiet place to continue to work on some of her, I don't know if it was this novel in particular, but I think it was, And we offered our home at Pendleton Heights. So while John and I took a break, she and Fred moved into Bethany College, Pendleton Heights, and did some of her literary work right here on our campus. So she knows it well. But let me just say my deep respect for Marisel comes from her commitment to women's issues and her love, deep love for Puerto Rico. She tells marvelous stories about the beautiful Caribbean island, informs us of the important history and the colonization of the territory, and she highlights the struggles that women face in particular, wherever they live. These are translatable analogies and stories that she tells, but deeply ingrains us in the life of Puerto Rico. It is critical for us at Bethany to read, study, and meet and greet writers from diverse backgrounds. And Marisel, it is an absolute joy to have you back on campus virtually. And we will look forward to having you on campus personally. And you and Fred are always welcome at Pendleton Heights. If you want to write yet another novel, just let me know. I'll give you the house for a week. Welcome. Glad you're home.
Thank you, Dr. Rodenberg. Marisel, again, welcome. And thank you for reading a little bit for us and being willing to talk to us about the book itself and some of the issues that the book raises. I wonder if you would start us off by reading us a little bit from the novel.
Thank you. I'm happy to. And I will be taking you up on a week for my retreat so that I could just not have any interruptions. That'd be great. Thank you so much. And you're recorded making that offer, just so you know.
That's right. It's a standing offer. I'll find some place so you can have the whole quiet.
Okay, I'm going to read chapter 4 of The Taste of Sugar. Elizabeth, Dr. Hall requested this. So I thought it was a fabulous idea. Chapter 4. We're going to meet Angelina, who is the mother of Vicente, one of the main characters, and she is also, in this section, the future mother-in-law of Valentina, the second protagonist. Chapter 4, How Angelina Was Saved. One day, when Vicente was still a boy, Angelina woke to the rooster's crow and went to the river to drown herself. She stopped to disengage the hem of her nightgown when it caught on a branch. Only when she stepped on a twig did she realize that she was awake. Her bare feet were cold and wet with dew, but what of it? She reached the river where the laundress Destina washed the laundry and bedding. Her husband bathed here every night, but Angelina was of the class of woman for whom it was not proper. Angelina stepped forward and gasped at the water's coldness. She had never learned to swim, but she felt a sense of peace. When next she opened her eyes, she was on the riverbank. "What's wrong with you? Are you crazy?" Raúl Vega shook her. "Don't save me next time," Angelina said. "I won't," Raúl Vega said. Angelina spent her days in loneliness and drudgery. They didn't have money to spare for her to visit her family, who lived only a few towns away. The roads were poor and would require a special carriage. When los hambrientos, so underfed that they resembled stick people, came to their door to beg for food, she bit back her complaints. She gave what could be spared and granted permission for the hungry people to pluck grapefruit and oranges from their citrus trees. Some days she gave away her own meal and pretended that they had eaten when she sat down with her husband and sons. There were evenings when she was alone at the table after dinner and smoked a cigar, filling her lungs with smoke as if it were her last breath. There was a time when Angelina blamed her discontent on her husband because he had never loved her, but then she had never loved him either. It had been a simple matter of need, he for a wife and she for a husband. Angelina's family gave some money for her marriage and it had saved the farm, but there were taxes and expenditures and always creditors. Every coffee farmer with a little education knew that the coffee harvest was at the mercy of the gods and the coffee market. Luckily, los peones who helped during the harvest could be paid in plátanos and bananas. Angelina employed a single servant, Gloria, whose hands had not been created for handiwork, but rather to pound the giant pestle in a mortar carved from the trunk of an old tree. Pound, 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 until the coffee beans were crushed into brown sand. Pound, 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 until Angelina wanted to scream and bang her head against the kitchen table. She restrained herself because she doubted that it would bring any relief, only a cracked head. Also, she didn't want to scare Gloria, who worked for room and board instead of wages, because, like most small coffee farmers, they had little hard cash. No one could say that Angelina wasn't a proper mother. As was the custom upon the birth of each of her sons, she sent the baby off to live with a wet nurse, one of Raúl Vega's peonas, who had also recently given birth. Angelina preferred a nursing mother whose child had died, and she lamented that she wasn't so fortunate to find such a woman for baby Vicente. She insisted that the peona send her own baby away while she nursed Angelina's son. She felt entitled in her demand because Raúl Vega provided rice and plátanos for the entire family. Angelina visited her child monthly to ensure his well-being, despite the steep climb up the mountain. The poorer the family, the higher up they lived. Other women of Angelina's class had been known to leave a child in the care of a wet nurse without ever visiting for an entire year or even 2. But she reclaimed her son upon the boy's first birthday. It wasn't uncommon for a woman to feel as if the child she was nursing were her own. When Angelina went for her firstborn Luisito, she and La Peona were in a tug of war, with Angelina's baby in the middle. Everybody screaming, Angelina, Luisito, la mujer who was nursing. The woman's husband had come running, demanding that his mujer release the baby and begging la doña's perdón. When it was time to retrieve Vicente, Angelina hadn't forgotten the scene with Luisito, and Raúl Vega came along to extract the baby from the wet nurse's arms. Evenings for Angelina were the worst, especially when she sat at the table, the candle burning down to the saucer, the dirty dishes from dinner in front of her, Gloria hurrying to remove them, chiding Angelina like any mother for leaving food on her plate, for sitting in the dark as if she were awaiting a visitation from Los Espíritus. Why was she moping? She had no reason to mope when life was so much better for her than so many others, como los hambrientos. Wouldn't she agree, Doña Angelina? So what if her husband was a mujeriego, always a different woman? That's how Papa Dios made los hombres. They probably couldn't help themselves in any way. Las mujeres had problems like that. It wasn't a curse, just la vida, or so she thought, since she'd never been lucky or unlucky enough to have a husband herself, but from whom she'd seen her in her 50 years or so living, she wasn't sure how long, because her mother couldn't remember cuando nacieron los bebés. She had so many, and nobody bothered to write it down. Claro, nadie podía escribir. What was she talking about? That from what she observed, it was better to keep your mouth shut and go about your cosas like la señora did. Sí, señora, calladita, not a word. La vida tranquila es más importante que los amores. Gloria pointed to herself. She had a calm life. So count your bendiciones, señora, starting with your health, and then this house and your sons. Are you finished with that cigar? Angelina handed her the stub. Gloria drew it to her lips and smoked it. One morning, Angelina was drinking coffee when a peón came to the door to ask for Don Raúl. Don Raúl ordered me to go to la casita. El peón pointed up the montaña. Did el don have special instructions? My husband has a house up the mountain? Angelina's gaze followed his finger. The jíbaro looked at the straw hat in his hands. Que metida de pata, he would tell his wife that night. The trouble he'd caused Don Raúl and maybe to himself with his big mouth. Angelina stared at the bohío. This was where Raúl had his assignations? No, no podía ser. After all the years of Raúl's poca vergüenzas, his many affairs that she had heard about from Gloria, who heard about it from the lavandera or one of the peones or fulana and thought it her duty to tell her. Angelina didn't care, but she couldn't help but be curious to see where Raúl conducted his assassinations. Bejuco vines secured the palm frond roof to a frame of poles. Because it was day, the hut's door had been removed and propped against a wall. At night, it would be set in place and fastened with vines or rope. El peón waited outside in el bate, while Angelina entered como la ama de casa, as if it were her own house, because in a way it was. She was careful where she stepped on the uneven wood plank floor, not the usual dirt floor of a bohío. Light came from the doorway. There was no window. A bird with a long beak flew inside and took a turn around the hut. El fogón sat on top of the crude wood table. There was a bench instead of chairs. 2 cups, a coffee pot, and a cracked blue pitcher stood empty. A tin gallon with aceite de Italia embossed on the label was filled with water. Angelina lifted it by the wood handle, nailed to the top, and poured a cup. Kitchen and eating utensils hung from the ceiling on long strips of imangagua vines. Sacks of coffee beans leaned against the straw walls. Angelina carried her water to the second room, which held a cot and a small clothes trunk. More sacks of coffee beans. She shook her head. Ay, Raúl, still so practical, even in your loveness. She had her hand on the trunk when a young blonde entered, her arms full of flowers. The blooms splashed red and pink and yellow on the faded blue of her dress. You must be Doña Angelina, the woman said. Mujer de Raúl Vega. Angelina came into the front room. And you are? Inés Quiñones. She set the flowers on the table. It won't take me long to finish here. Angelina heard the lips in the woman's Spanish like that of a Spaniard. Doña, con permiso, but Don Raúl's orders? The peón called out from the doorway. Don Raúl wanted you to help me with my trunk. Inés arranged the flowers in a pitcher. ¿Por qué te vas? Angelina looked at the pretty woman over the rim of the cup. Your husband told me to leave. Another woman? Angelina drank water. Inés shrugged. Have you family? Angelina noticed the woman's warm dress. I'm that most tragic of women, una viuda, Inés said. No children. You're a widow? Angelina frowned. And your mother, your father? No mother, no father, Inés said. Where will you go, a woman alone? Angelina set the cup on the table. Maybe someone in town? El peón cleared his throat. Doña Angelina, the day is passing and Don Raúl. The bird flew out. Angelina beckoned. Take the trunk to my house. Your house? El peón's hat slipped from his fingers. Don Raúl's orders. Your house? Flowers slipped from Inés's fingers on the table. Doña, perhaps you should think it over. Don't worry about Raúl, Angelina said. Él se enojará, his temper. The women exchanged glances. You haven't anywhere to stay, Angelina said. Perhaps I should apologize about your husband, Anne. Inés fumbled with the flowers. No te preocupes, Angelina said. My heart isn't broken. Sometime later, she would confess to Inés that on that day, she thanked God for her husband's poca vergüenzas. Now I'm going to read a very short chapter, chapter 11, called Waiting. It began the day such things always begin, with a glance that was more than it should be, with a phrase tinged with promises whispered in the air. Naturally, Valentina was not experienced in such affairs, but she was young and pretty, and all young and pretty girls enjoyed or tolerated such behavior from the males in their circle. When her father-in-law's gaze lingered a moment too long, when he complimented the delicacy of her complexion, the fineness of her hands, the luster of her hair, She'd come down with a nervous stomach, and Gloria would make her té de jengibre. The servant would hold the knob of ginger between her fingers and say, Valentina, feel this ginger? See how it's firm? That's how you can tell that it's good. Now watch how I use the tip of the knife to pare its skin. How will you learn to be a good wife if you don't pay attention, muchacha? You won't have me to make you ginger tea. Now Valentina worried all the time that Vicente's father might approach her in a way that would make it impossible to live in the same house with him. And then what would she tell Vicente? What would she and Vicente do, especially now that she suspected she was pregnant? Valentina would be in the kitchen with Gloria. Valentina, this is the proper way to iron your husband's shirt. Heat the iron on the hot coals. The shirt should be a little damp. If not, sprinkle it with water. Next, sprinkle it with a few drops of starch, which should be at hand. I taught you how to make starch the other day. You forgot? Did you write it down? See, this plant looks like a lily. This is a yatia plant. The tubers are in the earth. I will show you how to dig it out. This stone molino is what you use to grind corn into flour to make sorullos. This is how you soak the beans. This is how you boil the guayaba for pasta de guayaba, because Vicente has a sweet tooth. This is how you tell the difference between culantro and cilantro. They are cousin herbs, or maybe brother and sister. And Gloria would snap her fingers in Valentina's face. Muchacha, ¿dónde estabas? Your mind should be in this pot of beans. One day, the woman's stare unnerved Valentina. Oye, muchacha, te doy un consejo. Gloria carried a coconut and a cleaver over to the table. Never be alone with Don Raúl. But he's Vicente's father, mi suegro. With the tip of the cleaver, Gloria poked a hole in a small part at one end of the coconut. Bring over that glass. Valentina set a glass on the table. Gloria flipped the coconut upside down, filling the glass with coconut water. He tried his poca vergüenzas with me long ago when I first came, but Doña Angelina threatened to cut off his thing when he was asleep, and that was that. Valentina gasped. Pay attention. Gloria balanced the coconut on her palm and gave it a couple of whacks with the cleaver. I couldn't do that. I'm afraid of large knives. Gloria set the cleaver on the table and broke the coconut in two with her hands. You'll learn. What should I do about Don Raúl? Gloria picked up the cleaver. If he tries anything, he'll have to deal with me. Gloria, eres loca, Valentina laughed. And Gloria did too.
It's marvelous. And I love chapter 11. It's so funny and so scary at the same time. And one of the things that really struck me when I was reading this novel was the sort of strength of the women characters in it. And I got the sense from those pieces that some of that comes down in the mother's line, right? It hands down. And none of these women are the mother of Valentina, but they all are, right? Gloria and Angelina and Inés are mothers to Valentina. We also think about writers as giving birth to their literary works. It's a really old metaphor. Men used it 600 years ago, and we still use it today, and I've heard you use it also. What is your role as mother to these pieces of the history of the women of Puerto Rico that have been erased?
What is my role as a writer?
As a writer, as the writer of the works that you write.
I feel that it's very important to write about Puerto Ricans, and especially Puerto Rican women, because in the culture, and especially when I was growing up, but still I've heard younger women talk about this. There's definitely a double standard, and women are taught to be subservient to the men in their families and in general. So I think that when I write, I usually don't think further than the page and than the characters. I think about the overall picture about what I want to say. And then I think about the people who I feel are necessary to say the story. And with this story, I felt definitely Valentina, but also Vicente, because the genders were so different. Not the genders, but the roles of a male and female, and those genders were so clear and so different in that time period. So I felt I needed two people, a man and a woman and a man, to tell the story of this period and these people and this novel. So that's what I think about. Who, I guess in a way, maybe if you're thinking about giving birth, if you're talking about it specifically, then I would say who would tell these, and the birth I think would be the characters. Who would be the characters, who would be the children, and that would be Valentina and Vicente. But because so many people do not know the Puerto Rican culture, and because the Puerto Rican culture is really based on family, and at least in my own personal life, had many characters, I needed to have more than two characters tell the story, or three characters, or four characters. So there are multiple voices in the novel, as you know, Elizabeth, but two main and 1/3 secondary, who is Raulito, Vicente's half brother, and also an important person in the book. But I felt it was necessary to have multiple voices. And in that way, I didn't intentionally, when I write, it's intentional, but it's also kind of, it springs from the work, from the thinking, the additional characters. I might be writing and somebody pops up who I didn't know 5 minutes before. I guess the character must be like lurking in my subconscious, kind of like in theater, waiting for their what is it in theater, the cue or the, to pop up. And that is super cool. And that is a gift that I am given, and it just adds to the joy of the work.
Awesome. So I'm going to push this a little farther, I think, outside the novel, because we think about the colonization of Puerto Rico. But one of the stories that's been erased, especially for people on the mainland, whether they're Puerto Rican or not, is the colonization of women's bodies in Puerto Rico. And I know that you know a fair amount about that, and I wonder if you would be willing to talk to us about it a little bit.
First of all, I would like to say that I consider the Puerto Rico, and the United States, the United States. I don't, in the past, I may have done it, but I have chosen not to call Puerto Rico the mainland. And so I'm going to say the United States from now on, because it really isn't the way Puerto Rico is treated, and the lack of Puerto Ricans able to vote for president, for example. US president makes it a separate country. It's clear that it's a separate country. So
and I'd like to sort of follow up with self-determination, but after this question.
Sure. And it's like we only have however much time we have, so it's totally cool. But actually, when I was there at Bethany College, what I was working on was not The Taste of Sugar. I was in between drafts, and so I took that opportunity to work on a play that I am writing, and that my daughter and I are working on together. We came up with the idea. Eventually, we hope for my daughter, Lisa Vera Ramos, who is a theater artist, to direct this play that I'm working on. And it's called You Can't Cover the Sky with Your Hands, because that's based on a Puerto Rican dicho, or Puerto Rican saying, that you can't, no puede tapar el cielo con las manos. You can't hide the truth, basically. That's what it means. And the play is about how the United States used Puerto Rican women, the bodies of Puerto Rican women, to test their population control policies that they would go on to use in other parts of the world. They were already in the United States in the I don't know, maybe like the 30s or the 40s, doing things against Native American women and African American women. But in Puerto Rico, it started about the 1920s and 1930s. First, they started with an unofficial program to sterilize Puerto Rican women to solve this imaginary population control problem that the United States and the Puerto Rican government said was a problem in Puerto Rico, but it wasn't overpopulated. It just didn't have the resources to feed the people and to support the people. So one of the things that the United States and Puerto Rican government thought would solve that problem in a fast and easy and economical way for them was to work on sterilizing Puerto Rican women. And it was first funded by people like Gamble, as unofficially in the 1920s, and more officially beginning in the 50s. And it's called like La Operación in Puerto Rico. But by the 1970s, 1/3 of all Puerto Rican women of childbearing age in Puerto Rico had been sterilized. And it didn't matter if you had children or not. Very young women who had never had children beginning at age 18 were sterilized. And some women chose to be sterilized because that was the only method of a contraception that was available to them. They might have had 6 or 7 or whatever many children, and they needed something, and that's all that was available. And some women didn't realize that it would be very complicated to, they said to tie your tubes and to untie them, that it might be very laborious, complicated, might cost a lot of money. And so one of the things that we're showing in the play is that some of the operations were done without informed consent. For example, if a woman went to the hospital to have a baby in Puerto Rico, there were many hospitals where the doctors, there are cases where the doctors refuse to deliver your baby unless you sign the form to be sterilized immediately after. So it's a very rich subject in a very horrific way. And that's what our play is about. And also another thing that was done in the 1950s was the pill was tested on Puerto Rican women, again, often without informed consent. Sometimes with consent, but not a lot of information was provided. And what's really interesting is that Margaret Sanger supported this. She got her very, very wealthy friend, the philanthropist, Elizabeth McCormick, I think that was her name, to fund it. And Elizabeth McCormick was really excited of this project of having Puerto Rican women as a cage of guinea pigs. The problem was that the pill was 4 times as strong as what would be tested in the 60s on white American women. And when the Puerto Rican women complained about passing out, some had strokes, like 4 died, their symptoms weren't given any kind of priority or importance, let's say. But it did matter when white American women had these same symptoms, and they went to the Senate and they demanded that, for one thing, in the birth control pills, the little thing in the back that said this can cause these kind of problems, that's why it's there, because the white American women were able to do this. So
Just as a quick historical note, experimentation on the bodies of enslaved women in the US began in the 1840s with the father of gynecology, which in itself is a phrase to reckon with, that there could be a father of gynecology.
I mean, eugenics, it's because of eugenics, eugenics and who was a really big thing around that time. Isn't that when it was started, Elizabeth?
In the 1840s, what he was ostensibly looking for was ways to improve outcomes of labor and childbirth. But he experimented surgically on enslaved women without anesthesia because they could take it.
Can you imagine?
I just, it's sort of horrific. And, the intersection of gender and race has resulted in some pretty bad stuff. Yeah. So that makes me want to ask about autonomy for women, about the right to stand up and say no. And that makes me want to ask about autonomy for Puerto Rico as well. And I wonder if you can sort of catch us up on the movements for statehood versus the movement for self-determination that are swirling around, one bill of which is in Congress as we speak.
Well, I support AOC's bill, Nidia Velasquez, for a convention. That would be, I think it's a convention, and the different parties with different goals would be funded so that everybody could like pitch their thoughts, their preference. So that's what I support. I think that a good comparison is how Hawaii is doing now, and compare Hawaii to statehood, to Puerto Rico. And I don't know that people who are not very, very wealthy in Hawaii would think that statehood is so fantastic, not from what I've been reading. So I think maybe we need to do some more thinking and research on Hawaii. I think that they still have to pay to have their goods shipped in just like Puerto Rico, and they're states. Does that answer you, Elizabeth? Maybe.
I think maybe for folks listening, because I've been sort of researching this, and I have a friend from Vieques, and but just understanding the distinction between statehood and self-determination, the movement for self-determination, what some of the ends of self-determination might be.
Well, obviously, I'm not in favor of statehood for Puerto Rico, because I don't think it's going to make things so fantastic. For one thing, we would have to compare Puerto Rico to someplace like Mississippi. And in terms of how Puerto Rico is poor, and is Mississippi doing great? I don't know that much I can't really speak for Mississippi, but I think there are a couple different things: statehood, independence, and the third option would be some kind of associated state that's different from the one now, because the one now is not working. So it would have to be, that's where we would have to work out something. And I believe, well, every Puerto Rican in Puerto Rico should be able to vote. Only Puerto Ricans should be able to vote for that. Only Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico are going to be able to vote for that. But I also advocate for Puerto Ricans like myself to be able to vote, because my parents had to leave, especially my father had to leave Puerto Rico because he could not lived there. He couldn't eat. They were very poor. And that's why I'm here in the diaspora. My mother was a little different. She might have wanted to come on her own because she was a little more adventurous she hated living on the mountain. And the novel I have Valentina hating to live on the mountain. That was my mother. So it's a very complex subject. I don't feel like I am the best person to speak in detail about it, but I recommend that everyone look up Jose Lopez and the Puerto Rican Cultural Center. I did an event just last week or the week before, and we talked more about self-determination, the Self-Determination Act. And he was a much better speaker, and I think that he'll be able to clarify the situation better.
He's genuinely impressive. My last question for you has to do with silencing and erasure. And you have spoken in the past about the need to speak for the young and for the ancestors, to speak these stories, these histories, these truths that have been erased through linguistic difficulties, through the United States imposing US history learning rather than Puerto Rican history learning on students in schools in Puerto Rico, on even language barriers between generations of Puerto Ricans. And I wonder about your desire, your passion to write the works that you do and how that connects to your sense of injustice for erasure and silencing.
Well, I think as a girl growing up in my family, from the very beginning, I felt a sense of injustice, that I was a girl and I couldn't do the things that my older brother is only a year and a half older than me, and our lives were just totally different. I remember once I had to iron his shirt, and I was so mad that I had to iron his shirt. We were teenagers, and I burnt a hole in it on purpose. And so from that time, it was like his favorite shirt. I didn't have to iron his clothes anymore because he didn't trust me. So that was okay with me. But one thing, in my new novel, I have this one section where I write, this chapter is called Rules for Puerto Rican Girls, because there were so many rules. One thing that I recall when I was growing up was I was taught, my mother, women are part of the problem, not all women, but when we continue to push the patriarchy, we're part of the problem. My mother taught us girls, I remember this clearly, when we enter a room and men are talking, you stand next to them and you don't speak, and you wait for them to acknowledge you and to nod to you to give you permission to speak. Yes, this is true. And so from a very young age, I could just feel I was burning inside with the injustice of being a girl. And then once I learned about how I didn't know anything about being Puerto Rican, I learned that too when I was young, because I had questions and no one could answer. In high school, in my honors history class, in the history book, there were 2 lines about Puerto Rico. It was a Commonwealth of the United States. I'm like, what the heck is that? No idea. I come home and I asked my mother, who was a brilliant student in Puerto Rico, and she told me, Puerto Rico es un estado libre asociado. And basically that's a Spanish version of a Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, but she didn't know what that meant. What does that mean? Of course, that happened in the 1950s, and she was in high school in the 1950s. That was 1952, but she didn't know. So there were just so many things that we didn't know. And through my research, I learned that the education minister in Puerto Rico was an American. until like the late 1930s or 40s. And he got to set what was taught in Puerto Rico. Recently, I talked to one of my aunts in Puerto Rico when she's like an 87, and like, Tia Soli, can you tell me about your books? What language were your books in? She said in English. Her books were in English, even though she didn't know English. The teacher didn't know English. And her job, the student's job, was to translate the books in English to Spanish. And she said she liked it because she said that she learned English. I have never heard her speak English, but I'm assuming when she tells me she knows English, that she knows English. But can you imagine right now having your students look at French, any book, and like, okay, translate it. How did they translate it? I can't imagine that they each had an individual dictionary. I don't know. So it's a mystery. Maybe in one of my future works, I'll try to discover that, or somebody else will write about it. There are just so many stories about Puerto Ricans and Puerto Ricans that need to be written in the English language, so that a lot of Puerto Ricans here in the diaspora can't read Spanish, and also people who are interested and who want to support us can learn about Puerto Rican culture and about Puerto Ricans. I think it's really important for Puerto Ricans like me to know where we came from, so that we can place ourselves in the present day and think about the future. What do we want for our future? And that's where this self-determination bill is important. We have to know where we are and where we came from to understand and to consider what is best for our future. And when you know, like, the really bad shit that has been done to Puerto Rico in the name of democracy and in the name of the United States, it makes you wonder, do we really want statehood?
All right, well, thank you. I wish this could have gone on much, much, much longer. And on behalf of Bethany and all of the friends of Bethany who are watching and will watch, thank you so much. For all of you out there, The Taste of Sugar is available in an audio version, currently in a beautiful hardback, and in July, a paperback. There are, for those of you who are in book clubs, there's a book club question package that goes along with it, with questions supplied by Marisel's brilliant son. So she's fortunate to be the mother of two very brilliant young people. Marisel, thank you. Thank you very
Elizabeth.
much.
This was a pleasure.
And
Thank
I
you for
hope
inviting.
I hope we get to do this again very soon. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Super interesting conversation. Thank you for inviting me. I was excited that you wanted to talk about gender.
Happy Women's History Month, everybody.
Thank you.